Hi again, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of the course. I'm kind of excited to see what you guys do with the task for week 3 because I think it's maybe the most interesting one. But on the other hand, it might be the most challenging one in terms of working out how to get good source photos. But I think it's such an interesting one, and when I noticed this in photography and then sort of found some parallel examples in illustration, I started to realize like how commonly it's actually used, and it's a really important visual or compositional skill, I think. So anyway, let's get started. As usual, we're going to go with a little bit of theory. I'm going to show you some slides and pictures first, and then we'll move on to an explanation of the practical part of the task. This week we're going in an even more experimental direction and thinking about how to use living elements to create a striking composition. Something I realized when I was kind of researching and thinking of concepts for this course was the idea that you don't actually have to use static elements such as architecture or trees or cars or similar to create framing in your composition. You can actually use individual moving elements, living elements is what I mean. So this could be people, this could be animals, and so on. Using this technique, it can sometimes, which I hope will be obvious when I show you examples, can sometimes be an even more extreme way to focus attention on a single character or like a key part of the scene that's about the plot or story. So the example for this week is a photo by Alfred Eisenstedt. And I think that, this is a very complex photo of these soldiers or officers standing on a spiral staircase. Eisenstedt is known for actually taking candid photos, so they were often kind of like accidental and spontaneous. But then I also found in his collection of photographs, there is this sort of small series of them that are more like these ones, where they are very kind of organized and very posed. So these are his particular photos that I'm taking inspiration from for this concept. I think this one is really interesting because, like, if you have human figures, they can often be the subject of the photo, but in this case, they are acting as the actual framing device in the photo, and they kind of become sort of insignificant in some ways. They're just kind of a structural device, and it's very, very dramatically done here. So even though this is not such a formal structure as the classical or asymmetrical framing, I think that there are some general characteristics that we could possibly talk about in terms of these kind of like living frames. So as I've already said, it's a type of composition in which people or animals, or maybe parts of them, it doesn't have to be the whole figure, act as a key framing device. They can actually be symmetrical or asymmetrical, it doesn't really matter. It can be a really extreme way to focus attention on one point or one character in the composition, but as you can see with the first photo I showed you just before, there was actually no focal point of that composition. So the kind of living frame can actually be the composition in itself. They can end up looking very kind of formal and very structured, particularly if you use this kind of symmetrical classical style with them. So it's just something to be aware of. And the other thing that I think you will find when you go to take these photos, and it's the experience that I had taking these photos, is it can be very hard to kind of like accidentally grab photos of this. So you might have to take more photos than you took for the previous weeks. I also want to show you a few different photos by Alfred Eisenstedt because I think that, for example, this one is also using people as a framing device, but it's working in a different way to the previous photo that I showed you. I think that here they are kind of used as a system to point to a subject or focal point, which is obviously sort of this mannequin head and the teacher giving the instruction to the students there. And so it's different to his previous picture because, there was a focal point, but it was the ceiling, and it's not anything of narrative interest, but here the focal point is of narrative interest, and by clustering the girls around like that, it adds to the sense of narrative and storytelling in this image. And here's another image by Eisenstadt, which I think also fulfills this kind of criteria, or also demonstrates this type of system with creating like integral aspects of the composition with humans, and in this case dogs. It's not quite even on the left and right side, but more or less it's going in the direction of being a kind of classical symmetrical composition, and then the placement of these dogs in the foreground, and then the other man with the dogs in the background creates like a triangle, which is pretty easy to see, I think, when you look at it, which again works very effectively. It's something that you see also in a lot of classical artworks, artworks from the Renaissance and things like this. I think this works very effectively in terms of kind of providing some framing in the foreground, which is incidental and just works to balance out the composition and to actually direct our focus forward into the picture towards the man with the dogs, who obviously ends up as the focal point of this picture. Plus, I also thought that I would show you a few examples just from films. So again, I think logically, perhaps, Wes Anderson is also a fan of this system, and you can see this type of use of characters and figures and crowds in his films as a framing device, and very, very often in this kind of classical construction. So when everything looks quite even and it's all very carefully composed, because this is his main style. And then I also thought that Stanley Kubrick is a really good director to look at in terms of like very meticulous shot composition that's all very well planned out. Just a really like careful attention to rules of composition and like some techniques and tricks to kind of give a particular atmosphere, or as I said before, to use some framing techniques as a narrative device. This is from his film Barry Lyndon, which is an absolutely like incredibly composed film in terms of like how it looks visually. So this is a pretty good example of how this system can be used with a larger group of people. And again, sort of like our perspective is it's like a 1 point perspective basically. So everything is starting, off larger with the crowd scene on the left and the right and the figures. And then, again, we have this idea of all of these elements. In this case, the elements are the people pointing towards this central figure, which is the man wearing the black hat. And then that's sort of emphasized by the army standing in front of him, and then that's further emphasized with the two flags that are held up by the soldiers there. And then that's even more emphasized by the fact that the top of the mountain peak is almost perfectly aligned with the center of the picture. So this is a good example, as you can probably already recognize, of this symmetrical classical composition. But in this case, the key elements of the framing are actually people. And then another film by Stanley Kubrick, but it was basically, I think, the last film that he ever made, Eyes Wide Shut. And you can see some similar tricks with cinematography that he has used in previous films. So in a lot of these kind of scenes, he uses the shape of the group of the figures to kind of highlight the center of the composition, to highlight the characters that are in the center of the composition. And he's using some extra tricks to do this, which are obviously in terms of color choice. Obviously the central figure has a completely different colored robe on, and so on and so forth. This one is interesting, and I wanted to show you specifically this one because the composition would be absolutely symmetrical and classical if it wasn't for the figure in the right, in the foreground. So it's just an example for you guys of what ends up being an asymmetrical composition. So you can use this, obviously, asymmetry or symmetry, it doesn't really matter, just whatever works for your composition. And of course, I want to also show you some examples of this use of living frames in illustration. This is an illustration by Noah Sneer, and I think this is a really fantastic example of this idea of using this kind of circle of figures around a circular table, and they are all kind of creating a border around the key narrative point in the composition, which is this head on a plate in the middle of the table. So I think that's a very kind of clear example, and it's easy to understand the parallels between that and what I've showed you already with photography. This is Keith Negley. A somewhat similar idea, although the figures around the focal point person are a little bit more chaotic, but it's also used incredibly effectively here to kind of draw our eyes to this main character. This next one is by Sonia Pulido, and I think this one is really intriguing just because it ends up being something like an asymmetrical composition but it also has some elements of symmetrical composition as well, so you might argue it either way. But I really like the way that the figures in the foreground are made so large, and they also seem to be lined up with the walls, so they sort of almost become part of the architecture, and they sort of create this feeling of a stage, or this very kind of theatrical presentation of the narrative. And all of this leads our eyes into the smaller part of the composition and the character on the right hand side running off to the right. And I just thought I would also show you a more kind of crazier example. This is Marie Canstad Jonsson, and this is maybe something similar, like the idea that was shown with the first photo that I showed you, the Alfred Eisenstadt photo, with the idea of using the characters in the illustration to create some kind of shape or frame that doesn't really have any purpose apart from the fact that it just looks very, very dramatic and very striking. There's no focal point in this at all because there's just a white space in the center, but it doesn't really matter because the main intent of creating this type of composition is just to kind of give a bold and very dramatic effect. And so a little bit about the task for this week. As you can already understand, your objective is going to be to go out with your camera phones again and capture some interesting compositions with this idea of living frames. So it can be composed using people as key elements, or possibly animals if you find a location that has them. For this week, I'm offering basically free choice as to the location, but I can make some suggestions. So it might be worthwhile to go somewhere where you can have a view of people from above. It's an easy way to kind of get a group of people sort of in a kind of configuration, but then your illustrations are going to be from an aerial view, and so you also have to be interested in doing that or comfortable with that, and it's also maybe not everybody's taste. So think about this carefully as to which location you would like to choose. Another suggestion I have is to choose somewhere like a park where people are grouped together, for example on picnic mats. The weather's changing a little bit now, so it might be a little bit more difficult